Hello, welcome, and thank you for being a part of WorkSafe's Preventing Exposure to Welding Fumes webinar. My name is Cameron Ling, and I'll be your host for this session. This morning, we are exploring the following key topics: the January 2024 reduced exposure standards for welding fumes, what employers are required to do to control exposure, and also how can employers utilize the hierarchy of control to implement the highest level of controls. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by two WorkSafe Victoria experts. Will Neville, Inspector at WorkSafe. Good morning, Will.
Morning, Cameron. Morning to everyone at home.
Great to have you with us. Also joining Will is Halil Ahmed, Principal Hygienist at WorkSafe Victoria. Great to see you, Halil.
Yeah, morning, Cameron.
Thank you both for joining us today to talk about this topic. We'll be taking questions from our audience a little bit later on, but please feel free to start entering your questions at any time. Will, I'd love to start off with you if I could. And perhaps to start us off, could you explain what exactly welding fume is and why is it harmful to health?
Yeah. Well, welding fumes it's basically a combination of metals and gases that are produced when the metal is heated during the welding process, and it becomes vapor, and then it turns back into solid when it cools back down in the air. It's harmful if it's inhaled. It was classified as a carcinogen back in 2017, which means that it's known to cause cancer within humans, and it has both short-term and long-term effects. And those short-term effects can be such as eye irritation, mucous membrane, and respiratory irritation, metal fume fever. Longer-term effects can be things such as lung cancer and effects on the kidneys.
Thanks for that, Will. Halil, could I come to you? Can you tell us about exposure levels and the new one that now applies?
Yeah, Cameron. Workplace exposure standards are basically concentrations that are measured in an employee's breathing zone, so sort of roughly around their face, sort of usually attached to their collar. And it sort of monitors someone's exposure over their working sort of day. And then you come up with a concentration. Now, the exposure standards that are set by Safe Work Australia, and then each of the states and territories pick them up in their legislation. They're set at a level below which most people shouldn't experience impairments or undue discomfort. And the welding fume exposure standard is what's called an 8-hour time-weighted average, meaning someone works an 8-hour day, it's measured over their 8-hour day, and then and if they do welding only a few hours, it's still averaged over that 8-hour day. So the new exposure standard, as you mentioned, in January this year, it did come down, and it came down dramatically. It came down from 5 milligrams per meter cube as a time-weighted average to 1 milligram per meter cube. So that's a big reduction. And the exposure standard of 1, it shouldn't be exceeded. It mustn't be exceeded in the legislation.
Halil, you're the principal hygienist at WorkSafe. How would you advise a workplace to control exposure to welding fumes?
With welding fumes, we're a little bit fortunate in some ways because they're actually captured under the hazardous substances regulation. So the regulations actually provide a structure in what to do. Where there's a risk, employers must be controlling the risk in accordance with the hierarchy. So most people have heard of the hierarchy of control: elimination, substitution, isolation, engineering controls, admin, PPE. So your engineering controls is the main focus that we are looking at. So we're looking at 3 types of extraction ventilation. On torch extraction, where we're really pushing on torch extraction as a practicable solution for a lot of workplaces. And that can be followed by sort of flexible hood extraction units and other sort of extraction benches. Then there's personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment such as respirators are at the bottom of the hierarchy because there's more things that can go wrong. But they are an option if others are implemented so far as practicable first.
Will, Halil mentioned a stepped approach. Why can't employers just use a PAPR?
So with a PAPR, as Halil mentioned, that's considered PPE. And with that, fumes are still emitted from the welding process. And if the PAPR isn't used correctly or maintained correctly, it may not be as effective as what it could be in preventing that person being exposed. And not only that, as I said, the fumes are still being emitted and they can build up within a workplace, and they can then be exposing others in the workplace who may not be part of that welding process to be then exposed to those welding fumes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Will, can I stay with you for a second? What are some simple things an employer can do to assess the level of risk?
Yeah, one of the big key things that you can look for is if you've got a visible haze or a smoky outlook within a workplace. There's an odor, like a taste in the air that you can, when you walk in there. Look at the type of welding that you're doing. So MIG versus TIG versus stick welding. MIG having a higher, so out of the main ones, MIG having a higher exposure compared to TIG. What type of materials are you welding? You know, is it stainless steel? Is it galvanized steel? Has it got surface coatings such as paints that can emit other fumes and hazardous substances coming from that? Look at the work process and in the environment. Is it large? Is it small? If you're welding in small confined booths, you may get a bigger buildup of fumes rather than a larger space. If it's outside, you know, it can get rid of the fumes easier than if it's inside. Consult with the workers. Ask them, are they feeling any of the health effects that we've discussed earlier, like dry throats, irritated eyes, such as that. And look at also incident reports. So if there's been some incident reports where the people have started to notify the workplace of incidents where they've had dry throats or coughs, things like that, it may be attributed to the welding fumes as well.
Halil, what do you look for on site to detect a possible hazard?
Yeah, like something very easy for an inspector or a hygienist who walks into a workplace is to see if they've already undertaken air monitoring. If they've undertaken air monitoring and it's evaluated someone's exposure, it's a straightforward tool to use to say, yes, there is high levels of exposure and there's a risk to employees, or whether exposure is being controlled adequately. Some easy sort of markers, if you like, as well, is the actual arc time. So when we're talking arc time, we're talking the flash that occurs, so how long that flash is occurring, that arc time, and that's can give you a good idea. And there's reports that suggest that if you're exceeding 1 hour of arc time, and this is in a general statement, 1 hour of arc time in a relatively open area, undertaking something like what Will said, MIG welding, you're likely to be requiring an additional control. Where you're sort of around that 1 hour, it might be a case of you need to take a more detailed assessment. The number of welders will also contribute. Like if you've got 20 or 30 welders in a relatively confined area, and that's going to contribute, someone's welding will contribute to the other person's welding. And then if you've got other persons that are working or walking in and out of that area, their exposure needs to be considered as well. The shift length is a factor also. So the exposure standard I mentioned has come down to 1, but if you've got a long shift length, the exposure standard, that the number that you're actually measuring against becomes a smaller number, because you have to allow for recovery time for employees as well. So there are various factors that you do need to consider. And if there's uncertainty, you can always engage a hygienist to come out and do the air monitoring. And then really you need to review your controls. Like there's certainly above the exposure standard, you must implement controls. If you're not above the exposure standard, it's still worth implementing controls to reduce employees' exposure.
And flowing on from that, Will, what happens if employers aren't controlling the risk?
Well, if we enter the workplace and there's a risk to health and safety, generally we would issue a notice for them to control that risk. What we would be looking for is what controls are available to be implemented within that workplace, what are currently in place. So if they are using PAPR, we may give a longer term time to put a higher order of control in. But generally, we look at timeframes and we try and work with that workplace to get those controls in place as quick as possible.
And also, Will, what has been some of the feedback from workplaces that have implemented engineering controls?
So there's been some really good feedback from workplaces. one of the big ones is they've had noticeable health improvements, sorry, such as not having dry, sore throats, not having that niggly headache at the end of the day. Another thing is cleanliness in the workplace. So they're not having a fine particle dust that's building up in that workplace as much. And just overall, the quality of the air is improved for everyone. And, walking into these workplaces, especially where you've had visible welding fume in the air and walking back in afterwards, it's clean, it's clear, it's a nice workplace to walk into.
Yeah, that's really good feedback from those engineering controls. Great to hear, Will. Halil, I'll come back to you. How is WorkSafe helping employers understand their obligations and use the necessary controls?
Yeah, we've done a lot of consultation with representative groups, like employer groups, unions, etc., to raise their awareness of one, the actual reduction in welding fume exposure standard. We did a lot of that earlier on in particular. We also spent a lot of time informing the inspectors across WorkSafe, across Victoria, that this is coming, so that they could have that conversation with workplaces that they were visiting. The other thing that WorkSafe has at the moment is a proactive visit where we're identified a whole heap of workplaces that undertake welding. We're doing visits to those workplaces to establish what their controls are, raise their awareness, and get them on the path of having appropriate controls. We've got guidance material out on our website, assists our own inspectors, but it also assists a lot of employers. It's very good guidance. It provides from the beginning of what is welding fume, what are the hazards, the risks, and what the controls that should be implemented, and providing practical images and examples. And there is also a good video now embedded in that of a workplace that actually implemented controls, and the benefits to them, as Will mentioned as well. And so there's some practical solutions as part of that control solution on our website. So very good information.
So what are the key things then that people should be actioning today?
I think you should look at your workplace, look at the tasks that are being performed to establish how long someone is undertaking welding itself. Try and establish the arc time. The arc time is the critical time, if you like. We often go into a workplace and we say, how long do you do welding? Oh, at least 6 hours a day. And then when you break it up further, the actual arc time might be 50 minutes because of the prep time that's required, or other activities that stop, start, etc. So really understand the arc time, how long someone's performing work, number of welders. If there's several welders that are then contributing to other person's exposure in terms of the welding fume, are people working in that environment that aren't welders that are potentially exposed as well? So understand who's exposed, how long they're exposed for, and that should help you determine whether you need further controls. And if you're not sure, you can always undertake a more detailed assessment and engage an occupational hygienist to come along and do some monitoring, as we mentioned before, personal monitoring, where someone measures in the breathing zone to establish their actual exposure.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Halil. And also to Will for everything you're sharing with us. I'd love to go to some questions now. We're getting a few coming through. Just remember, to all our audience, you can keep entering your questions right throughout in the Q&A box there. I'll try and steer the questions as best I can, but please feel free to jump in or add anything on top. This first one, and a lot of people wanting the answer to this, how far away should other workers be from the welding taking place to ensure they absolutely don't need to be concerned with just 2 workers welding, is the example given here?
Yeah. It's not a straightforward X meters is the distance. It's really how that workplace is set up as well. So is it an open area? Are there controls already in place? If it's 2 minutes of welding that's undertaken and that's all, then it might not. It most likely wouldn't be an issue for the other persons that are in that area. So it's that assessment that really needs to be considered. And as I mentioned, it's the assessment for the welders, but the assessment for other persons, as the caller has raised, that are nearby.
Great, thanks for that, Halil. Does WorkSafe have occupational hygienists who consult, or do they need to be sourced privately?
Well, we have so much work that we don't consult, but there's the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, and you can log onto their website, and they would have a list of consultants that can come out and undertake that sort of work. It also identifies what areas they might specialise in, or the areas that they have a particular knowledge in that can assist.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm not sure who's best to answer this one, so I'll open it up to either of you. Is there a short-term exposure limit or a STEL?
I might jump in, Will. There isn't a short-term exposure limit. There is just a time-weighted average, which is the 8-hour exposure standard. So if, let's say, you're welding for 1 hour in a day, that might be intermittent. So you get measured for the entire shift, or at least half of a representative shift. And then that's then extended for that 8 hour, and then you understand what the exposure is compared to the exposure standard. So there are constituent sort of welding fume ingredient or constituent exposure levels as well. But at the moment, with the 1 milligram per meter cube, that's probably as good a marker as you need. There will be changes in December 26, where the exposure standards will be reduced for a number of substances, and that'll raise other issues or other concerns that we can talk about there later.
Great. I might be continuing on with you here, Halil. You're getting a nice rest, Will, but please jump in if you want to. Can grinding dust be compared to welding fumes?
Not really, no. Like it's a different. It's not a welding fumes is about heating it as Will described, so that you're generating it into a fume and then it's recondensing. It's coming back into a metal form. So it's not. You really do have to try and split the difference. And sometimes it's not that easy when someone might be performing welding fumes and then 2 minutes later they're grinding as well. But you do have to try and split the difference.
Great. Will, I might come to you on this one. What should be considered when building a welding area? So this is perhaps a possibility of a brand new start, setting it up right.
Yeah, well, obviously you're looking at where you're setting it up, the space around it that you're giving it, not only for the fumes, but also for the arc flash. So you want to make sure that you're not exposing people in the area for any of the hazards associated with welding. If you're setting it up from scratch, you'd be looking and going, how can you incorporate, or in this case, engineering controls in the best way, so that they're seamless, basically, and can not only reduce those fumes there, but for the rest of the workplace. So that's what I'll be looking for. And space is the big key. Make sure you've got plenty of space around it.
Great, thank you. I might continue on with you, Will, on this one. If the work environment is restrictive, so they can't set it up brand new like you're just answering there. If the work environment is restrictive and assessment shows PAPR is the only option, how would WorkSafe see this?
So it's like all things, we say reasonably practicable. So certain things, when you're looking at that hierarchy of control, it states that you must do something on the highest order unless it's not reasonably practicable. So if engineering controls, for instance, like the nozzle may be too large to get into some small spaces, or I couldn't see that engineering controls for a restricted area wouldn't work, but it may be due to the actual welding process that they're doing. It may be restrictive. So that's what we'd take into consideration and work through and go, can they do 80% of welding with engineering controls, and it might be 20% of the welding that they may not be able to incorporate those. So it's trying to work out how they can get the best controls in place without just relying solely on PPE.
I wouldn't mind adding just a little bit more. Sometimes it is worthwhile speaking to the suppliers of the equipment, like the engineer in on-torch extraction, other extraction systems. They usually supply powered air purifying respirators as well. And they've got really experienced people that can provide that sort of understanding to say, this is a viable option, or yes, you're better off going to PAPA units.
That's a perfect add-on, Halil, because I think it flows on to the next question. So I'll steer it initially to you. Matt asked this question. I can go to somewhere like Bunnings and buy myself some welding equipment without any safety equipment or training. Will we see any changes in this space so there are more obligations on manufacturers and suppliers to inform, educate, and perhaps require consumers to comply with safety standards?
Yeah, like there are duties on manufacturers and suppliers of equipment. Primarily, we focus on employers. So if they're going to go off to a place that sells generic type equipment and obtain that equipment where there aren't specialists to advise on, then the duty really comes back to that employer to try and get that additional information from specialists. So we try and steer people to specialised workplaces that can supply them and then provide the knowledge that's required.
Great, thank you. This one here, probably to you, Halil, I think. In what circumstances is health monitoring of workers required?
Yeah, there's a list of substances in the hazardous substances regs. I mentioned earlier that welding falls under hazardous substances, the regulations, and there is a relatively short, if you like, list of substances. And for example, chromium is on that list. And the way the health monitoring requirement kicks in is where if it's likely to result, if someone's exposure to that substance is likely to result in an adverse health effect. So it comes down to, are they likely to be above the chromium exposure standard? So if you're doing stainless steel, for example, chromium is an issue. You'd want to understand whether your employee's exposure to chromium is above that standard. And if it is, then you'd start looking at health monitoring. But there's not many substances on that health monitoring list for which health monitoring is required. It is an area that probably requires further looking at nationally, I'd say.
Great, thank you. I might continue with you, Halil, on this one. Do welding fumes hang around after the welding? I.e., if arc time was 6 minutes over 30 minutes prep, etc., how long would it take for the welding fumes to leave the area and others to be able to enter the area?
Yeah, welding fume can remain around for a long time after welding. Like sometimes you know of workplaces where they come back the following morning and there is still a haze in the air as a result of the welding that was undertaken. So it sort of does a little bit depend on the type of metal that's sort of condensed and come back, etc. But it does remain a long time. So you can't just assume that arc time is over, I can now take off my helmet or my respirator and I'll be fine. It's still in the air. So obviously the concentration is when the welding is occurring and the person's their face is close to the welding arc, but it is still in the air and that needs to be considered.
Great, thanks, Halil. Will, I'll come to you on this one. How long do businesses have to comply with the new reduced exposure limit?
Well, the reduced exposure limits, they came into effect from January this year. So basically from now, workplaces need to be assessing and trying to get compliant with those exposure standards. They need to be looking today at basically at what they can do today to try and reduce that, and then look at long-term options and go, how can we reduce that further and get as low as we can, as quickly as we can.
Great, thanks, Will. Halil, I think I'm coming back to you on this one. Is there any evidence of natural immunity to welding fumes? Obviously, the WES are based on averages, but assuming there are workers at each end of the spectrum, those who are very sensitive and those who may be very resilient.
Yeah, well, it's a reasonable thing to sort of consider, because you do hear of stories of people that have worked side by side and someone comes down with an illness and someone doesn't come down with an illness. It's about their sort of physiological makeup, but I don't know enough about to say certain physiological makeups will have that resistance and others won't.
Great, thanks, Halil. What type of monitor can measure the smaller particle matters below PM1?
PM1 is particle matter, like it's the material, it's the size of the particles in the air, and really, we're talking about welding fume. So there is specific equipment that you use for welding fume. There's Australian standards for measuring this type of material. So it's sort of laid out in the Australian standard. It's not about the PM1. It's about respirable and inspirable type of material that's established processes for.
Okay, great. Now, I'm not sure who's best to answer this one, so I'll just put it out to both of you. How often should workers be fit tested?
It's fit testing is where it's to do with a tight fitting respirator. So we're not really talking about powered air purifying respirators, which are sort of loose-fitting helmet-type respirators. But in relation to tight-fitting respirators, WorkSafe hasn't got a you must be fit tested every year or so, but there's standards in relation to Australian standards in relation to respiratory protection, and I think that they talk about and this is like a recommendation, it's not a must. They talk about annual or 2-yearly fit testing, and so if you're looking at that sort of program, I'd be referring people to the Australian standard on respiratory protection.
Great, thank you. This one, a bit of a different one. If a staff member carries out any welding outside of business hours, i.e. at home on non-work related tasks, does this need to be factored in with calculations?
It's very difficult to monitor, and workplaces don't have control over what people do in their own time. And it's very difficult for them to then control what they do and take those into account. And that's why it's more important to actually reduce in your own workplaces that exposure to reduce any risk to your own business. And again, as I said, we don't look at people in their own homes or what they're doing outside of work.
Yeah, I think it's worth. I think it's worth. It's the information and education, aspect that is worth highlighting here. That the employer's got a duty to provide information and education, and hopefully that can an employee, I should say, can consider that in the work they're doing outside as well.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for that, Halil. This next one, how can a workplace put in better controls other than PAPR when there is no fixed welding station and welders cover a 30-metre welding jig and on-tool extraction introduces tripping hazards to other workers?
There's a number of factors there, aren't there? I'd be saying that there are some portable units like on-torch extraction units that can work part of that system that he's talking about. But once again, it's not about going to Bunnings as someone raised and buying the equipment and sort of going off and doing it. It's about getting that specialist advice. And it may be a case that for that particular workplace, powered air purifying respirators may be the way to go, or it might be a combination. It might be a combination of certain tasks on that activity are done with on-torch and other tasks are done just relying on powered air purifying respirators.
And the other thing I'd look at too there, Halil, is look at how the actual workplace is set up. If they've got tripping hazards, if the hose that's extracting the fume is becoming a tripping hazard, I would be saying that the actual welding lead would be a tripping hazard in the first place. So they might want to look up how it's actually set up in the first place and look at changing the task.
Yeah, it could be overhead. It could be differently done on a trolley, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. How can a one-off welding fabrication job, in brackets, over perhaps 3 to 4 days, be best protected in a work area that doesn't normally handle hot work?
I think it's your assessment at the whole start, isn't it? Because if you're introducing hot activity or a different activity into that area, you do have to consider everything else that is done in that area to start with. It's a generic answer, I know, but it is really taking it back to the specific workplace to understand it. And that means that the person who's going to be doing the welding has to appreciate what other hazards there are. The employer needs to try and eliminate other items from that area as well to sort of not contribute. So it's really a specific assessment.
Halil, I might continue on with you on this one. Is soldering captured in this standard?
Soldering, I don't think, would be generating enough heat to be able to get the metals to that point. So you could certainly generate some level of exposure in terms of some of the items that are coming off. I just don't know whether you'd be generating enough heat and enough contaminants to be a welding fume to sort of compete with the welding fume exposure standard.
That makes sense. Might continue with you, Halil. How can we measure the 1 milligram? How can we ensure that we comply with the new legislation?
Yeah, it's not something that an employer would normally undertake themselves. It does require specialist knowledge. So it's the engaging like an occupational hygienist to come out, understand your workplace. So they really do understand what it is. Are you doing MIG? Are you doing, is it stainless steel metal? Is it coated metal that's being welded, etc.? And then on that basis, who to monitor the people, like whether it's one person, whether it's a series of people undertaking different tasks or representative tasks, and then measuring preferably over the full shift. And then they can send away the samples for analysis by a laboratory, or even weighing them to understand how much welding fume has been captured. So it's really not doing it yourself unless you're a hygienist, but engaging an occupational hygienist.
Sorry, and I'd also add.
Will,
I'd also add into that, if they're thinking that they're somewhere close to the exposure standard, they should be actually starting to think about controls, before they're actually going out and getting assessments and looking at their controls. And if they're actually controlling the risk, such as on-torch extraction units, they won't be at the exposure standard, so they won't have to, they won't be meeting that requirement.
It's a good point. It's worth noting that monitoring costs money, but then the outcome of that might end up being you have to then implement additional controls anyway. So you're sort of, if you're near the exposure standard, we spoke about 1 hour of arc time as an indicator. If you're sort of around that mark, it's probably best to put your money into your controls and move forward that way as against the monitoring side.
Great. Now, Halil, your answer may have already answered this next one, but I want to ask it just in case there's any clarification needed. Welding fume monitors don't necessarily measure appropriately. How are you able to accurately get results? What data is sufficient for WorkSafe?
Yeah, I think what they might be referring to is you can get monitors, sometimes referred to as static monitors or fixed monitors, that measure the particles in the air, the size of particles and particles in the air. That gives you good information. But when we're talking about exposure standards, we're talking about personal monitoring, so monitoring roughly in the breathing zone, attaching a little sampler, and that determines the welding fume, the actual welding fume, as against a static monitor sitting in a location. And then that's sent away and analysed. Now, if you want to have a look at specific ingredients or constituents in that welding fume, then that sample is then sent off to another lab for further analysis to determine things like manganese, chromium content, etc. as well. That's the way you'd go about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I reckon this next one too, Will, you've just answered it, but I'm going to throw it in there. When conducting risk assessment, the controls can be hard to determine without knowing the actual level of exposure. Employers can be reluctant to do air monitor, install engineering controls. Is it best to just accept there is a level of risk and use higher level controls? Is that exactly what you were saying just before?
That is exactly what workplaces should be aiming for, even if they're slightly below. Whatever they can be putting in place to reduce those in the long-term application is the best for the whole workplace.
Fantastic.
I think this might be an opportunity to talk about what I was mentioning earlier, and it was that in December of 26, I know it seems like far away, but it'll come fairly quickly. The workplace exposure standards for a number of the ingredients in welding fume will fall. And instead of looking at welding fume, some of these workplaces will then have to look at those ingredients, because you'll be able to get to those levels much quicker than the welding fume level. So which means start looking at your controls now, even if you're, let's say, below the actual welding fume exposure standard now, because it's likely that you'll have to implement additional controls come December 26.
It's a great point. Thanks for that, Halil. I'm not sure who's best to answer this one. What can secondary schools that are resource and finance poor do to comply with the standard update and still teach young people work skills needed for future careers when money is not forthcoming for engineering controls or the purchase of PAPR PPE?
I think without knowing the specifics of how long they're actually doing welding for and the exposure that they're actually being within that time, it's very difficult to say whether or not there's a risk to the health within those within the schools doing that, and without doing a specific visit or someone doing an assessment on that, it'd be very difficult to ascertain whether or not there's enough exposure level. Having said that, it should be one of the considerations that they should be looking at as part of their budgeting and going, what do we need? How can we, what improvements can we put in place for the future?
Thanks for that, Will. Halil, I'm going to steer this one to you. Again, another clarification, please. Are plasma fumes included in this category?
Oh, I'm not sure, Cam. It's a welding type activity. I think they would be, but I'm not sure. I'd have to double check on that.
This is good. We finally stumped you on one of the questions. It's okay that you don't know every single one. Appreciate that question for whoever asked it. This next one, natural human biological variations and individual susceptibilities, e.g. existing medical condition, mean a small number of people may still experience adverse health effects from exposure at levels below the WES. I know that's written as a statement, but can you respond to that?
Yeah, it is a statement, and it's a fair statement because the exposure standard is not for absolutely everyone. It is designed to protect most people from undue discomfort and impairment. So there are going to be some individuals that still experience some impact below the exposure standard. So.
Great, thank you. You've been both talking a lot about on-torch extraction and those engineering controls. This one here, probably a really important one for people to consider. What are the costs of on-torch extraction and local exhaust ventilation versus PAPR?
Your PAPR can vary, like maybe from your sort of lower level $1,000 to $2,000, and they can be very good units. Your on-torch, you're probably looking about $3,000 to $4,000, maybe $5,000. But you're talking about a much better control because it is controlling at the source. Powered air purifying units are really good, but they protect the wearer while the wearer is wearing it. As soon as they take it off to look at the weld, as soon as they take it off to talk to someone else, prepare the next item to weld, the welding fume that's just been created, it's still in the air if there aren't additional controls. So it's better to look at your on-torch, localized extraction to capture it as close as possible to where the fumes are being generated. And even saying that if people are saying, well, I'm not sure it's going to exceed the exposure, spending money on undertaking an assessment, you're talking $3,000 to $5,000 possibly there as well. Whereas you can redirect that money into your on-torch extraction unit and you've saved yourself that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that, Halil. This is just a question a number of people now jumping onto, just to clarify one of your statements before. What ingredients are being considered for lower exposure limits in December 2026?
Yeah, like chromium was one, whether chromium becomes really low or whether it's taken off any exposure standard is a point of discussion at the moment. Manganese is another. It's being looked at being reduced quite significantly. So and I think iron oxide might be one as well. But they're examples. Like manganese, you'll find them quite easily in various welding activities. So that's going to have an impact.
Great, thank you. This next one, happy for either to jump in here. Is financial reason a fair reason to stagger the implementation of air purifier units on welders over a year or so? I'm getting costs of $5,000 to $7,000 per unit to set up. Financially, it is not viable or reasonably practicable to go and buy every welder one of these units.
So we're talking PAPR or are we talking on torch? The question...
Given it's every welder, I'm going to guess PAPR, but I'm not sure, Will.
I think the cost would probably be like a local exhaust ventilation system. So either on torch or some sort of extraction hood. It's looking at each case by case, but you'd still be saying, is it practicable to introduce some on torch, some local exhaust ventilation, and have your workplace designed to be able to cater mostly for those items to be done there, and then others in other areas. And then you can rely partly on powered air purifying respirators or respirators themselves, and on torch or localized extraction. So we can't say yes to the answer or no to the answer, yes or no to the question, but it is a case of we'd expect them to implement the higher order controls to the extent that they can before they go down to lower order controls.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more questions. I am conscious of time here. What are your thoughts on welding fume control measures to the welder and others when structural welding works take place out on an EWP or large construction site?
Yeah, well, generally on a construction site, and I'm talking generally, they're outdoors. So they've got natural ventilation, which is reducing that the welding fumes around. The user still needs to be mindful because their face is still within that breathing zone. So it may be a case, especially on construction sites, that they may still have to use PAPR as their control because it might not be practicable to set up exhaust systems on that welder because it's being a portable unit. A build up within those workplaces, the risk to others should be very minimal because it's a transient type work. It's not in the one place and doing a lot of welding at once.
Great, thank you for that. This one here, is there a guide chart similar to that of noise exposure time for general welding arc time?
Yeah, I'd be very happy if there was, Cameron. There's not. We use roughly the 1 hour as a guide, and it's only a guide. You have to take into consideration whether it's confined in terms of the welding area, any other activities that are being performed, other welders that are nearby that are contributing to that welding as well. So unfortunately, there's not. No.
No, thank you to everyone who is asking all these questions. I know there's a heap more coming through. I don't have time for them, unfortunately, but we do appreciate everyone who asked questions. So many good discussion points taking place there. Thank you, Will Neville from WorkSafe. Will, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Cameron, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And a big thanks to Halil Ahmed, also from WorkSafe Victoria. Halil, thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure, Cameron.
Great to have both of you sharing your insights today, explaining the way that workplaces and employers can mitigate the risks of potentially dangerous welding fumes under those new industry standards you spoke about. Well, we hope that everybody has found this an interesting and informative session. This webinar will be available on WorkSafe's website in the coming weeks, so please look out for that one. We do value your opinion very, very much on our Health and Safety Month events. So shortly, we will be sending you an online survey. We would love it if you could provide your feedback so that we can incorporate your suggestions in our program next year. All respondents will go into a draw to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. Shortly, we will show on screen a list of all the contacts or programs that we have covered today. And if you have any requests for further information, we recommend you to please get in touch. Also remember, if there is something you want to discuss, there is the WorkSafe advisory line open from 7:30 a.m. until 6:30 p.m. Monday to Friday, and also the emergency line, which is open 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. Thank you for being a part of this webinar.